Good afternoon and welcome. My name is David Wortley. I'm the Virtual Conferences Director at IORMA. I'd just like to say a few words of introduction before I hand over to our moderator for this session, Richard Jackson. The IORMA Consumer Commerce Centre it's a neutral resource for businesses and governments that recognise the need to understand and respond to the ways in which the 7.8 billion global consumers are changing. In the products and services they want and need, and also the ways in which they want to obtain these services. And these changes are happening globally, driven by developments in society, in business, and also in technology. So this webinar is one of a series of thought leadership discussions held every other Thursday. And the topics are chosen from IORMA's Horizon Scanning, its surveys and its research. And just to remind you, you can type in questions throughout the whole of the webinar, and I hope you will take advantage of this facility. We just ask you to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen rather than the chat button if you want to ask questions. So now, without further ado, it's my pleasure to hand over to your moderator for this session, Richard Jackson. So, Richard, over to you.
Great, thank you, David, and thanks for the introduction. And welcome everybody to this IORMA webinar about whole life carbon cost. I'm hoping over the next hour we can tackle what we mean by whole life carbon cost, why it's relevant, and maybe how we might address it. And I have a esteemed panel to help us address those three questions. I'll ask them to introduce themselves in a minute. I'm Richard Jackson, as David said. I'm the Director of Sustainability for University College London. And I suppose my interest in this stems from a long career around the field of sustainability. But two things in particular, I suppose, has sparked my interest. Firstly, I worked for 7 years on the Olympic project as part of the design and construction team. And when we came to looking at our strategy for focusing on reducing our environmental impact, one of the big issues for us was how do we tackle carbon? And not just the carbon that we were looking at as a society at that point in time, the carbon related to energy, but actually the whole life carbon of a project of that scale. We did a groundbreaking study to establish our carbon footprint, which basically came up with a figure of 3.4 million tonnes of carbon related to the London 2012 project, of which around about 60% was related to the pre-games construction and the development of venues. So we're not talking about a small amount of carbon to deal with as a result of construction of infrastructure. The second part of my career, which has touched on this, is through my work more recently with UCL. And we have a £1 billion capital programme going on at the moment, which is to expand our campus, not just in Bloomsbury, but also over on the Olympic Park. And it's through that we've been more looking at the impact of whole life carbon costing and what we can do as a client to tackle that. And I'm hoping I can maybe draw in some of those examples through this particular webinar. Before we get started, I do have to apologise because I'm only going to be with you for 45 minutes, and then I am going to hand over to Lewis just to take us through the end of this session. But hopefully I can steer the conversation to a point where Lewis is able to wrap up and give you some sort of clear, I suppose, some clear suggestions on what you might do moving forward to look into this whole area of whole life carbon cost. We're going to start with a poll. So we're going to start by asking you a couple of questions about yourselves and your organisations. So David, do you want to bring the poll up? And we'll pause for a second just to get you to respond, and then we'll look at those answers. So the first question, have you personally or your organisation taken any steps to reduce your carbon footprint? and obviously that I suppose doesn't surprise me. I mean, I think most organisations are now looking at the impact of their organisations on climate change and then also their carbon footprint. Do you want to move to the next question, David? Okay, so when it is possible, would you be prepared to reduce international travel? So that's interesting. So I suppose two things there that strike me. One is we're increasingly seeing businesses and individuals wanting to tackle carbon, but I think what the second poll, I suppose, highlights is the difficult choices we're going to have to make if we are going to try and tackle carbon. And some of those choices, I know as a university where we have a lot of academic travel, means that we're going to have to think about new ways in which we can do business and try and reduce our carbon through taking these difficult choices. Okay, thank you for that. I'm going to now introduce our panelists, or at least ask our panelists to introduce themselves and say a little bit about who they are, where they work, and also why whole life carbon cost is of interest to them. And I'm going to start with somebody actually I've worked with before, so a professor, sort of like an interest in this. It's Sue Kershaw.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Richard. Sue Kershaw, Managing Director of Transportation for Costain, and my other jobs are visiting professor at UCL at the Bartlett, looking at major project and program assurance, and also president of the Association for Project Management. Delighted to be here this afternoon. I deeply believe that we must get to net zero, and that is followed really by one reason I moved to Costain. We've very much got it on our agenda. Our leadership meeting this year for the whole of our leadership is the race to net zero, and every single one of us on our projects, and Lewis will go further on this on HS2, we're committed to making it happen. Thank you, Richard.
Great, thanks. So good university to be a visiting professor for as well. Lewis, let's come to you next.
Thanks, Richard. Yes, so my name is Lewis Barlow. Hello, everyone. My background is civil and environmental engineering, and I work for a company called Sweco, and there I lead a carbon team and have done for about 10 years. And my expertise area is carbon and infrastructure, really the wider built environment as well, and that is management and minimization of whole life carbon, as you're saying, is very important to tackle. And I'm currently seconded into the Scottish Government to assist in the transition to net zero, working on a £5 billion city and regional deals development package. So that's a quick outline of me. Maybe we could move on to other people, then I'll come back. I've got a couple of slides maybe just to run you through.
Great, thanks, Lewis. We are coming back to you very shortly. And the last panelist for us is Ian.
Good afternoon, everybody. I've spent a lifetime in infrastructure. I'm a chartered civil engineering surveyor by original qualification, but moved into management and became a companion of the Chartered Management Institute, which is probably more relevant to my life. I'm chairman of GCP Infrastructure, which is a FTSE 250 listed business in London. We're the only listed infrastructure investment fund on the London Stock Exchange. And I'm chairman of the Exchange Infrastructure and Estates Exchange, which is trying to move infrastructure as an investment class into a tradable investment class. And I spend a good deal of time with my visiting professorship at Manchester Business School in infrastructure, investment and construction. I'm on a number of other boards which are less relevant to this conversation this afternoon. I, like the rest of the panel, believe that this isn't optional, that this is an absolute requirement. I find it difficult to understand people in the face of the evidence who still doubt the importance and seriousness of this matter. And so to the extent that I can help this afternoon, I would like to contribute in relation to what I think need to be the policy changes at government level and in the industry, driven probably by us as investors in infrastructure, to make this happen. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Ian. Right, with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to Lewis, who's got a few slides, which hopefully will set some context for this afternoon's discussion. Lewis.
Thank you again, Richard. Okay, here goes. Let's share this. Okay. Here we go. Okay. Great. Can you see a slide there? Good. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay. So yes, a bit of background to this to the subject, particularly focusing on carbon and infrastructure, and then also really considering carbon and cost in infrastructure. And so for clarity, when I say carbon cost, I'm not just talking about carbon emissions. I'm sort of talking about financial cost and how that relates to carbon emissions. So a couple of statistics here and a quick bit of background to the subject. In 2013, the UK Treasury published the Infrastructure Carbon Review, and that was a result of the government, UK government, looking at where carbon was emanating from in the UK, and it identified infrastructure as a key problem. So the percentages you see here, 16% of all UK's carbon emissions come from construction, operation and maintenance of infrastructure. And when you incorporate the use of infrastructure into that as well, it goes up to 53%. And by 2050, if we don't do something about this, then 90% of all UK's greenhouse gas emissions will be associated with and result from infrastructure. So tackling carbon and infrastructure is very, very important. And we know we're in a climate emergency. We know we have stretching carbon reduction targets, and yet we know that there is more infrastructure to be maintained and to be built. So we have to somehow join the dots between these two issues. Okay. So in latter years, I've been really focusing on this relationship between carbon and cost. And this was first really seriously pointed out in infrastructure in that infrastructure carbon review. And the central message of that document was reduce carbon, reduce cost. So in a way that stands to reason. If you reduce carbon, you're reducing quantities of materials, natural resources, energy, and you should be therefore reducing cost as well. This graph here, this schematic graph, this sort of curve, is illustrating the diminishing ability to reduce carbon and cost the later you leave it in a project. So it's sort of emphasizing the importance of dealing with carbon and cost right up at the beginning, potentially tackling the tricky issue of, do we need to build the thing in the first place? Now this slide here, we don't need to go into the details so much, but I'll explain the basic concepts. On the left-hand side, we have carbon. On the right-hand side, we have cost. This was within a particular project I was looking, and I'd taken out the extraneous structures and unusual bits and pieces to try and get a feel of where carbon was sitting for an average kilometer of road, and where also was the cost sitting. So the bars that you can see were two elements of a roads project, and the main elements were in drainage, earthworks, and pavements. And that's also where the cost was sitting mainly. So the highest carbon items were the highest cost items, which again stands to reason when you think about it. But and I've seen this slide so many times over the years that I'm almost immune to it. But actually, it's done the rounds a lot, this slide, because it empirically demonstrates what was set out in the infrastructure carbon review, that if you reduce carbon in infrastructure, you should be reducing cost. And it busts the myth that carbon reduction should be expensive. So, there's lots of more research that shows this too. So that's an important takeaway. Now, weaving the two things together again, the carbon and cost, I think it's useful to think of three categories: a granular level, where you're looking at individual nuts and bolts and curbs and paint and bits and pieces. All these things are within a bill of quantities. They all have a cost and they all have a carbon value. If you divide one by the other, you'll get a carbon cost intensity, which is very useful to designers and engineers to empower them so they really understand both the carbon and the cost impact of everything that they do. At the other end of the spectrum, there's project level carbon cost intensity. So there'll be a total project cost and a total project carbon value, divide one by the other, and you have a carbon cost intensity at a project level. That's useful, but it's not so useful until we get a big database of these kind of numbers. Then we can say, for a given type of infrastructure, a type of building, is this a high or a low carbon cost intensity? But the most useful one really is the mid-range. So it's the options appraisal stage. You know, we need to cross a river. Do we cross it with a bridge or a tunnel? We have a building to build. Do we build it using traditional steel and concrete or timber? You know, how do these decisions affect carbon and cost together? And key to all of this, and one of my main recommendations is we need to put carbon and cost on the same page. So I think this is my penultimate slide, and it's probably the most important one. This is, if anything I want to convey today, it's this carbon cost tipping point. So the infrastructure carbon review talks about reduce carbon, reduce cost. Fair enough. I've already demonstrated, you know, that is mostly true, but it's not always true. And there are certain instances, certain points where you will have to spend more to reduce carbon further. So for example, the lowest carbon concrete is more expensive than traditional concrete. The lowest carbon steel at the moment is more expensive than traditional and easier to access steel. The lowest carbon construction techniques at the moment cost more. These are carbon cost tipping points. And we have to understand what these tipping points are and be able to eradicate them, get rid of them if we're going to get to net zero. So this is a very important point. We can't rely on reduce carbon, reduce cost to take us to net zero. We have to understand the cost of this and work out serious high-level mechanisms to get rid of these tipping points. And this is my final slide. 3 circles representing my view of the evolution of carbon management. And in fact, there are 2 invisible circles off to the left of your screen, which I will quickly describe first. The first invisible circle off to the left of your screen is do nothing. You know, just nothing at all. Just don't even think about it. You know, not even a passing thought. And that still happens, believe it or not. It's much more rare these days, but it still happens. You know, you would ask, what's the carbon impact of this project? Oh, I don't know. I haven't really thought about it. Second invisible circle to the left of your screen is general qualitative waffle about sustainability. Okay, that used to be okay in some circles. You know, perhaps it was okay to deal with carbon by just talking about sustainability. And I think it's fair to say that that has that's not occurring as far as I see it anymore. Maybe in pockets it is. Carbon, for clarity, is a subset of climate action, and climate action is a subset of sustainable development. This is a science, really, but just talking about sustainability isn't dealing with carbon. Now onto the screen, we have carbon accounting. This is where we need to be for sure across everything that we do. And by carbon accounting, I'm talking about whole life carbon impact. It's the construction, the maintenance, end of life, operation, the whole thing together. What's the carbon impact? That's accounting. Management, carbon management is where we're doing something about it. We have to do the accounting first, and then we're saying, what can we do to reduce these various different areas, having an active process there. So it's moving from passive to active. And the final one is where I really think we need to get to is carbon cost management. Because carbon management could exist just off to the side in a kind of silo in its own sort of environmental world, and it's not really having a strong impact on the project and the design process. But carbon cost management means that it's central to the decision-making process, value engineering through carbon and cost. So that's a quick background to carbon and cost in infrastructure. It's a massive subject, but it is the key to the climate crisis. Back to you, Richard.
Great, thanks, Lewis. I mean, that's a really helpful introduction to what is a very complex issue for us all to try and grapple with. And I suppose I'm going to start by asking a question for all of our panelists. You know, when I think about your slides, Lewis, I suppose the first thing that strikes me is what's the role of government what should government be doing to try and drive change within the business sector and within the infrastructure sector? And I quite like your thoughts as a panelist, as a group of panelists, in terms of that particular question. Let me start that with you, Sue.
Thank you, Richard. I think the role of government is crucial, and as we know, everyone's preparing for COP26, and that's not very far away. And it's our chance to really grasp the agenda for net zero, but also to show the UK on the world stage post-Brexit. So lots of work is going on behind the background, but there's an awful lot to do. We need to look to government to set and enable us to deliver. So yes, the policies, but we can't expect them to do everything. It's down to every single individual to make that pledge, to make a difference and to do it quickly. So I think we need government to guide us, but we need to guide government into where we need to look to make the biggest differences in the quickest times, and also to get the funding to make that happen. To Lewis's point, we know where the tipping point is now. We're not going to get net zero for nothing. It's going to cost. So where is that money going to come from? And in public sector funding, is the public sector willing to actually fund that? Or do we have to, if you're going to increase the funds for net zero, then what gives? And I think there's those sorts of questions that this report, I think, really has started that debate. We have to look hard and long at it and decide what we're going to do as an infrastructure industry to make sure it happens, but not at all cost.
Thanks, Sue. I mean, just coming to this, the tipping point, Lewis, and sort of related to this government question. I mean, you know, should we be looking to government to set a carbon price that puts a sort of true value on carbon on those materials?
Okay, well, I should firstly say I'm seconded into the Scottish Government, so the views that I'm presenting right now are not necessarily those of the Scottish Government, although I think I probably am not speaking out of turn. I think, yeah, just to try and answer your question, sort of follow on from Sue there, I think the answer towards getting to net zero is a combination of public and private sector working together and identifying where those tipping points are, identifying how far can the private sector go really without becoming uncompetitive, really. So where does government need to step in to level the playing field? And to a carbon price, well, I think not necessarily the views of the Scottish Government, that yeah, we need to introduce a form of taxation. We need to introduce a form of carbon taxation that, in my view, won't look too dissimilar to the landfill tax. And I think we can learn a lot from the implementation of the landfill tax. It was brought in to create a massive change in the waste sector, and it did, and it generated loads of revenue. It was very successful. And the other key point about it was ratcheted up. It started reasonably low, but always with the intention that it would increase with an end point in mind. So yeah, I think that, and in fact I know that is being considered at the moment in a fair way. How can it be done fairly?
And Ian, I mean, the same question to yourself as we put to Sue and Lewis. I mean, from your perspective, and certainly with the businesses you work with, you know, what are businesses looking to government to help try and drive this agenda forward?
Well, thank you. I think we're looking for a level playing field. I think we think two or three things. I think, first of all, we think there should be a standard method of measurement for carbon, so everybody understands how the numbers are arrived at, and that it's done on a consistent and comparable basis. To our knowledge, that doesn't exist at the present moment in time. So the first thing we want is a standard method of measurement for carbon. I think the second thing we think is that there should be, every piece of infrastructure requires at least consent to proceed with it, or in ordinary lay terms, planning permission to do it. And I think we believe that planning permission should be conditioned on a permissible level of carbon at each stage, i.e. in site acquisition and design, in pre-construction, construction, maintenance, operation, and deconstruction at the end. And even to the extent that if people exceed the permissible levels, the regulators should have the power to stop the project and or to fine the project if they choose to do so. And then I think we don't believe that unless that is done, unless an environment of regulation is done, which is all embracing and is transparent and is accountable, we do not think that the target will be achieved. Not to be contentious in this conversation, but it's beyond cost. You know, public policy decided that it was not appropriate to kill people on the roads. It might be actually cheaper not to care and kill people, but public policy says no. If public policy says that carbon has got to be reduced to X, then that has to become paramount in this conversation, not cost. And the moment you start making cost negotiable, certain types of projects will have the potential to generate margins which can allow them to afford more carbon, if I can put it to you that way, and other fundamental strategic infrastructure will be able to pay for less. And my final point, I think, is that I feel strongly that there are two types of value with infrastructure. There's the user value and the non-user value. And I believe this carbon matter is going eventually to bring government to see themselves as the agents of non-user value, whether that's planning gains, economic gains, or carbon. They have to stand in the ring and act as the agent for those benefits, because the promoters, the private promoters of projects, don't have taxing rights and precepting rights on the general economy. And therefore, we need to bring that forward anyway, in my view, as a project financier. Very few infrastructure projects are truly fundable solely out of the fare box or out of the user values. And so the non-user values are critical to affording infrastructure, and HS2 is just a blinding glorious example of that. Government has a huge opportunity to create an environment for success here, or indeed failure.
Thanks, Ian. I mean, I suspect we will see some government intervention. What that looks like is still probably to be determined. I suppose moving on to kind of the businesses themselves. I mean, I really like, Lewis, your 5 circles of evolution in terms of how businesses have taken on carbon. I probably have experienced at least 4 of those circles, and not the last one. But you know, I think what certainly what I feel we're seeing at the moment is some more forward-thinking businesses who are already kind of advancing kind of methodologies for capturing whole life carbon cost and using it. I suppose the question I want to put to you is what can businesses do to put themselves on the front foot with regards to this particular agenda? And with that question, you know, what are we expecting from leadership within businesses, and then also what are we expecting businesses to actually do in terms of sort of first actions? And I'm going to come to you first, Lewis, on this one.
Okay, well, what can businesses do? I think, well, let's take house building, for example, and house builders as a good example of sort of private sector house builders, clearly interested in, you know, making money and good products, and also they recognize their contribution towards this issue. So I would recommend that businesses, you know, and I've worked with house builders on this, but other businesses too, businesses already, you know, should understand their carbon emissions, their scope 1 and scope 2 carbon emissions, you know, the fuel that they use, the energy they use to heat their buildings, and the travel around the place, these sort of things. That's okay. But they need to also get a handle on their scope 3 emissions. And that means the things that they build and construct, and the products that they are responsible for. So stage 1 is quantifying that properly. And for the house building sector, that's all the houses, all the materials, and what sort of different house building products can be produced, and create a timeline from here and your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions towards, well, 2050 in the UK, 2045 in Scotland, 2045 in Sweden, depends where you are, right? But you have to understand, it's a quantification thing, the carbon accounting thing, really understand what you're responsible for and how you can get it down to zero, and at what point it potentially becomes commercially unviable. What do you need to prepare for now? And it's, as someone mentioned in the chat, it's kind of a risky business, and we could do with real clarity on this so that people can start investing in products and services that might cost more at the moment, but they will be necessary later on. So in a nutshell, I would say proper, eyes wide open quantification of your carbon impact, direct and indirect.
Yeah, no, I must admit, I completely agree with you. I mean, it's certainly bringing in my own experience here at UCL, we've been looking at our carbon footprint over the past 10 years, and just to give you and the audience sort of like a sense of kind of what we're talking about, our scope 1 and 2 emissions probably make up about 15% of our total carbon footprint. The majority of our footprint as a university is wrapped up in scope 3. So that's the products and materials we use as a university and how we transport them to the university. So it's a significant chunk of kind of what we've got to tackle if we're going to be net zero. I suppose kind of just coming back to this question about what do businesses need to do, I think that the boardroom is obviously essential to this. And a dialogue with senior board members. And Sue, from your experience, where do you think sort of business boards are at the moment with the carbon agenda? And what's the appetite for introducing sort of whole life carbon costing into kind of, I suppose, business decision making?
Yeah, I mean, and I think as Ian said, this is now non-negotiable. Every single business in this country has bought into it. I've seen some polls recently that, if you don't think this is going to happen, you are very much the odd one out. So it's there, the leadership is there. I think to your point on businesses, it's great to say, yeah, we're going to be net zero, but by when, where's your plan, and how are you going to do it? That's the big thing for me. And we do have a really good plan at Costain, and we have lots of initiatives actually making it happen on the ground at the moment. So I think it is at the boardroom. It's at the boardroom all the way down to the guy or girl pouring concrete on site. There's a personal pledge from everyone that we are going to make a difference. And our biggest footprint is obviously cement and steel. We build things in the main, and we're looking at making non-cementatious cement for blinding, and to actually, one was fascinating, taking the blades off a wind turbine and using that to reinforce concrete rather than creating more steel. So initiatives like that are happening. We're looking at fueling all our plants with biofuel. So that's the here and now, the big plan, the what are we doing? How do we do it during the life cycle? We've got to design it in at the beginning. I was in a meeting today. We design for safety, we design for cost, we design for value. We need to design for carbon, and we also, I think, we need to design for accessibility, which is the next biggest thing on our agenda. We have to build it in there. We have to make sure as we go through our gateways, through the design, through the building, through the commissioning, that it will not get past the gateway unless it achieves the targets it's been given in any one of those subjects, but particularly in carbon. So it's not just going there and building the project and running away. It's what enabling works are you going to do for that project? What's going to happen to the local community from a carbon perspective? What will it actually mean when you move away and that taking a transportation project, that's an operational railway, for example. What's the carbon footprint then? And plan it all in day one and project manage it all the way through. And also look at the integration of what you're building, not just with the society around you, but with the other projects around you and the other elements that actually, when you're long forgotten as the constructor, and whatever you've constructed is there, it is a shining example of being net zero.
Actually, it's almost like we planned this, because it segues nicely into my next question for Ian. you know, what's kind of left behind becomes a shining example. I suppose one of the things that strikes me, Ian, is that there's some amazing things going on with individual businesses, but actually, given the scale of the societal challenge we've got here around climate change, you know, we need to kind of get out the mindset of being competitive on this and actually start to think about being collaborative on this. And what I wonder is given your work with businesses, you know, how much collaboration is going on, how much sharing of knowledge and sharing of learning is happening across the business sector?
Well, not enough, I think, is the first thing to say, Richard. But what I would say is that business is competitive, and what business can do is recognize that they should be competing about their ability to deliver. If we're staying with infrastructure, find the design and what is the requirement. I've already said I think there should be, as part of the planning, a limit on permissible carbon at each phase of a project. When those projects go out to tender, if we're still talking, leaving the government's playbook aside for the moment, within the government playbook, carbon needs to be a measurable matter. And companies like Costains, who are doing what they're doing at the moment, are putting themselves in a position to deliver low carbon projects, obviously. And that seems to me critical. If I receive a tender that says the permissible level of carbon in construction is X, and I'm tendering not only a price, but I'm tendering to reduce that carbon. And so I'm adding additional value to the client because I have ways and means of delivering it at a lower than the permissible level. That has a value. And that's where I think the cost and taxation and other benefits could be brought in. So most businesses are driven by the fact they are being required to be able to live in a low carbon environment, and therefore their ability and innovation to do that. And we're seeing that with BP and all sorts of things at the present moment in time. So I think we should let businesses do what they have to do, which is compete to be successful, to innovate, and to be able to deliver, not simply at price, but within limited permissibility of carbon. The other thing I would say as an investor in this project, it's investors that are starting to drive this. ESG, as I don't go to a shareholders meeting now as chairman of what is, as I've said, a FTSE 250 business. We have £1 billion sterling invested in infrastructure in the UK. And I don't go to a meeting without the investment advisors grilling me on what we are doing, what requirements we're imposing on projects and expectations we have for not simply environment, but social gains and the governance of that. So it is in the DNA, it's in the bloodstream, and it is being driven by the people in the private sector who provide the capital. It is central. It is not lip service. I assure you it's becoming central. Now, whether that's because the people with the money are wealthy enough to worry about their grandchildren, and there are some of us in the city who think that the genesis of this is that the people who are really controlling large capital flows at the BlackRocks and others are more concerned today about their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren than they are, and they see the world that we're going to be committing these people, next generations to, and that's what's driving it. And if it is, I don't mind what's driving it as long as it's driven personally. So businesses are about being effective and competing, and that's what I think businesses should do. They should be better at delivering low carbon solutions.
Great, thanks, Ian. I mean, it's really quite interesting for somebody who's worked in this field for 30 years and at times been described as a tree hugger sitting in sort of the corner of the office, to where we are now, where, you know, we've got serious investors really interested in the sustainability field. You know, I've seen the massive change that we've gone through. I am going to unfortunately have to hand over to Lewis in about 2 or 3 minutes. But before I finish, one of the areas that I want to just talk about is is around offsetting. You know, and I suppose one of the things that strikes me is we're still going to need infrastructure. We're still going to need the masses of investment in infrastructure, and it's unlikely we're going to achieve zero carbon with infrastructure, certainly in the short term. So how do we sort of start to look at offsetting as a means to kind of achieve net zero? And maybe let's start that with you, Lewis.
Yeah, I think we know offsetting is a last resort, and we were talking about companies, organizations having plans for getting to net zero. Now, a lot of the plans that I've seen, they actually rely heavily on offsetting. You know, there's not, I wouldn't really call them plans, because it just says, you know, we're going to offset. And then when you say, how are you going to offset? Well, I don't know, you know, but I think, well, I'm seeing a lot more scrutiny and research into offsetting, physical offsetting techniques, you know, that are geographically as local as possible to the project. That's ideal. And you can maybe categorize them into natural and anthropogenic. And I think it's probably safe to say that the natural solutions are not going to be enough. They have an important role to play, of course, and they have other benefits. But I think we really are going to seriously have to look into some technologies to be actively extracting carbon from the air. And if I was going to invest in something in the that will provide returns in 10 to 20 years, it would certainly be that area.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you, what sort of technologies do you think we should be looking at?
So, for example, direct air capture. So not just carbon capture and storage sort of at the top of chimneys to stop the instant negative effect of carbon coming from those industries, but it's actually actively extracting carbon dioxide from the air and then channeling it, ideally in a quite dramatic wholesale but quite slow reversal of what's been happening, extracting oil and gas from the North Sea, for example, using that infrastructure to effectively reverse the process and place the carbon from the atmosphere back into the geology in the North Sea. So quite a big task.
Thanks, Lewis. And again, Sue, you know, just around offsetting. I mean, you know, I think what I see is there is going to be a heavy reliance on offsetting to meet that sort of that quite large residual carbon that people have on their footprints. And I wonder where you and Costain stand on this particular agenda.
Well, I think, you know, for us, it is making sure that the offsetting, as Lou said, is meaningful. So it's actually, to me, at a more strategic level, working with government. Now we're post-COVID and looking at transportation plans and the building of new infrastructure, and to actually step back and say, with the way we're working now and the way we're living, do we actually need all of that new infrastructure, or can we be really smart on sweating the assets we've got and you know, really not building great big huge motorways when the capacity now is going to be much lower, even on, you know, the train network, the tube network, every single element of transportation in the UK. All the strategic plans have been torn up in the last 18 months. So I think we need to sit down strategically and say, how do we offset our strategies to deliver the carbon net zero that we need? I see it as a bigger picture rather than looking at individual projects and programs.
And I suppose that's where really good quality data on whole life carbon cost can help us to think about that strategic direction that we want to take. And Ian, I mean, coming to you again around offsetting. I mean, you know, there is a danger that businesses will see that as the last, not necessarily the last resort, but almost a get out of jail card, and probably put more into offsetting, and also perhaps invest in offsetting schemes that don't meet a sort of set of requirements around sort of additionality. I mean, you know, what's your thoughts on this?
It's an area that I have at least developed view of, to be frank. I think carbon capture of one form or another will develop. It's an expensive solution, and avoiding the carbon in the first place, I think, is very much to be encouraged. I'm asked to invest in forestation and various other things at the present moment in time by way of offsetting of carbon, and we are looking at that. But I think we can do more. I'm absolutely optimistic. Be careful what I say here, but just take hydrogen for a moment. Everybody thinks about hydrogen through electrolysis and having to put as much energy in as you get out, and we'll worry about whether it's cheap at night and all the rest of it. But the fact of the matter is that people have known for decades that you can produce hydrogen from a chemical reaction. The problem was whether it was the aluminium or silica, it oxidized, and the exothermic reaction slowed down or stopped. Well, I know that a client of ours has just got a British patent because they've overcome how the oxidation occurs. And so they're able to produce hydrogen today of such purity that it can go straight into a fuel cell. And it's an exothermic reaction. It produces as much heat as it does hydrogen energy. And you can start it with a battery. Now, I think hydrogen produced in that way will be of enormous value in being more optimistic about how we can reduce carbon from the atmosphere. And then when somebody told me that if you put hydrogen into the air intake of a diesel engine, you can reduce by more than 50% the amount of diesel you require. And hydrogen burns at a higher temperature, so it cleans the engine, prolongs the life of the engine, extends the servicing cycles, and actually reduces the pollutants by 70% because of the heat. Now, it's very new. It's just happening as we speak virtually. I think we need innovation. We need innovation like that. We need other forms of innovation to actually attack this subject in a very, very radical way. I personally think that solutions of that nature will be a lot better than carbon capture. That is my own view, and more likely to succeed.
Great, thanks, Ian. And apologies, I am going to leave and hand over the moderator role to Lewis. Before I do so, I mean, there's a couple of interesting comments in the Q&A section here. One is that offsetting is a cop-out, I suppose I would temper that by saying offset has to be a last resort. And we also need to understand what is our avoidable and unavoidable emissions. You know, I think those are some of the key questions here. And then secondly, as kind of a really nice segue, perhaps, Lewis, for you to pick up, is this whole question of innovation and where is innovation, who's driving innovation with regards to whole life carbon cost and the construction industry. And with that, thank you very much for your time. And Lewis, over to you.
Thanks, Richard. No worries. I've just discovered the Q&A as a separate thing from the chat, so that's good. And I've seen some comments in there as well. Well, let's just pick up on innovation firstly then. And I mean, Ian, that hydrogen innovation that you described sounds fantastic. So without having to go into the details of it, you know, how long would it take for that technology to emerge and become commercially available, and what can people do to accelerate that?
Well, it's already at TRL 5 or 6 at the moment. It has been sufficiently defined to be granted a patent. They've applied for international patents, and they're currently in the process of optimizing the material that would be used. Interestingly, if you use aluminium, the aluminium can be used as waste, and the alumina that comes out is more valuable than the aluminium that went in. I think it's hugely optimal. It also can produce hydrogen at 1 atmosphere. As you know, one of the other big problems, as Aviva's report said on hydrogen, the cost of producing it is one thing, but then the cost of storing it and the cost of transporting hydrogen has been a major obstacle to its more general use. What they're able to do with this chemical reaction is to produce the hydrogen at the point of use there will be hydrogen generators now in houses. The heat is used to heat the space and the water, and the hydrogen will be put into a fuel cell, produces electricity and batteries. It's clear to me that that will obviate even the grid. So we're on the point of seeing and this not just for this country, but think of developing countries which don't have power stations and don't have grid systems. Think of ships. There's a lot of water around. The ability to generate hydrogen on board ship as the ship is traveling, and to either wholly or partially use the hydrogen to fuel the ship and inject the hydrogen into diesel engines in the ship, which is one of the great pollutants. It's moving very quickly. You will see hydrogen used, generated from chemicals within the next 24 months, to answer your question directly.
Thank you, Ian. Just looking at a couple of the questions and comments there, Jane's suggesting or asking, at the point it becomes unviable for builders to build houses to meet their carbon targets, what then? Tents? No, I don't think so. I think worst case, the price of houses goes up. Ideally, the price of houses would even go down as things become more efficient and we start to introduce more of a circularity in what we do, not just a sort of one-way dead-end street for materials. But for that to work, there needs to be a level playing field, as Ian says, right across the house building sector, not just in one particular local authority, but right across the UK, for example, right across whatever country that you're in. So everyone has to meet the same targets and regulations. Gavin Stonnard, hello Gavin. How can we facilitate greater focus on whole life carbon in solutions at design stage? Something we haven't mentioned yet. A very simple answer to that in infrastructure is apply PAS 2080. Yeah. So if you are a project owner or a client and you're struggling with this question, how do we minimize whole life carbon in this infrastructure project? Apply PAS 2080. PAS 2080 is carbon management in infrastructure, a specification produced as a result of the recommendations in the infrastructure carbon review, and it requires baselining, carbon minimization right throughout the design process, and you will see results from that, which leads me to a question for Ian and Sue, who are the remaining people on the panel, which is about maybe procurement. And I kind of think that that's key in this procurement and making carbon a metric in procurement. And PAS 2080, I've seen personally, enables that, because you have a number to challenge people against. You know, it's not just a sort of waffly question about describe to us how you might reduce carbon on this project, asking a tenderer that, where they can say loads of things, you know, but if you're presenting them with a number and saying, how far can you reduce this number, it can be part of the quantitative tendering selection process, and that's evolving. And Sue, I didn't realize you used to work for TfL, but TfL, I had a discussion with TfL's energy and carbon manager, and this is about like 7 or 8 years ago. And he was doing great work on this for the Camden station upgrade, incorporating carbon as a metric in that. So maybe Sue, I could ask you first. You know, what do you think about carbon in procurement, and could we better it?
I think we absolutely could. I mean, we could better procurement full stop, which is what's happened recently with the Green Paper on procurement, and it's now going through with the Queen's speech into a reality of let's start to procure things properly and not blame everything on OJU, which is what we used to do before. And in the construction playbook, there are dedicated elements to procurements that mandate every single government department to include carbon in the procurement criteria. So it's taken us a while, but we're there. We've just got to turn that mandating into what does that really look like in practice, and how can we make sure that it's not too onerous whereby you actually turn off the market and no one bids for it. So I think that's the finessing we've got through now. I think conceptually we're there, yet to be tested, but conceptually we're there. What will it look like in reality? And how can we actually get people, the procurement industry, which is massive, get actively involved rather than passively just really, you know, looking at bids coming in and evaluating them. Be involved in your business, be involved in what you're procuring for, and get the sponsors of the procurements, you know, putting this at the top of their list.
Thanks, Sue. What about you, Ian? Do you have any thoughts on carbon in procurement?
Yes, well, I touched on it, I think, a little earlier. I think that there has to be a standard method of measurement. We have to have carbon accounting, and the numbers have to be up there in lights, just as it's there in pounds, in sterling or dollars or whatever. The carbon number has to be on the front page of the tender. It has to be a central part of the procurement. This is the permissible level of carbon. We're not allowed to do it if we can't do it within this level of carbon. And I have no doubt at all it will be done. And businesses and engineering consultancies and whatever will find solutions, but it can't be, price has to be secondary. It either is paramount that we reduce the carbon, or should we reduce the carbon if we can afford to? The latter is not the way forward, is it? So I'm quite clear that the projects have to start by having permissible levels of carbon and people competing to actually improve on those levels and get bonuses because they can produce it at less than the permissible level. In other words, it's a speed limit, not a minimum speed, it's a maximum requirement, and I think it's got to be transparent. We don't just want words. We actually need measurement. Engineers understand measurement, bankers understand measurement, everybody else understands measurement. So the tender isn't just a financial tender, it's a carbon tender.
Quite, totally agree. I remember the late David Mackay used to talk about needing numbers, not adjectives, for decarbonizing energy, but I think it's equally applicable to all of this, isn't it?
Absolutely. And in schools, you know, time doesn't permit today to talk about it, but this is such a transformation requirement that we need to be talking to people in schools and teaching people in schools, and much more focused than we are in universities about this. It has to become, this is either a matter of life or death, which is what it is. It's a matter of life or death. We better start treating it as a matter of life or death.
Quite right. And yeah, I always say that this is it's a STEM issue: science, technology, engineering, mathematics. I remember at the front page of the New Civil Engineer magazine about 3 years ago talking about the role of civil engineering and infrastructure in the climate emergency, and that fundamentally this is an engineering issue and a civil engineering issue at that. Now the NCE would say that, I understand that, but I do largely believe it. But the one element we haven't touched on, and I will just wrap up now, is perhaps behaviors and culture, and that really I think needs to be in place to enable people to agree to policy and to agree to regulations and agree to sort of making it happen. And I must give a shout out to the great Kate Simpson, who's mentioned there in the chat, and the work that Kate did on this in carbon conversations, in infrastructure, you know, getting it embedded into people's minds, which was pioneering work several years ago. And I think it's still sadly necessary. And I say sadly because I think it's sad that we have to try to convince people that we have to do this. It seems blindingly obvious to me, at least. But I see David's reappeared, which is a sign that probably we're going to be wrapping this up. So I think I will say thank you to myself, and also thank you for your valuable comments, Sue and Ian. And I think, David, I don't know if you're going to say finally bye-bye, but that is just about time up, isn't it?
Yeah, thank you very much, Lewis. You made a very competent moderator, standing for Richard. You've had a wonderful discussion today, and I certainly learned a lot, and I'm sure that our delegates have as well. So this is just a reminder for everyone as we come to a conclusion of this. First of all, thank you very much to Professor Ian Reeves, Lewis Barlow, Sue Kershaw and Richard Jackson for their excellent contributions, and also to all our participants for joining us this afternoon. I'd like just to remind you that there is a survey to complete at the end of this session. So when you leave the webinar, you should be directed to a page which will provide some sort of feedback on your experience and what you would like to see in the future. So with that, I'm now going to conclude by bringing up the final slides to say thank you very much for joining us again, and we hope to see you at our next events. And just to tell you what you've got in store, because these aren't included on the slides, in a fortnight's time we will be having a webinar on e-commerce in Africa. And then 2 weeks after that, we'll be looking at a topic which is very close to the one we've been discussing today. And so that webinar will be on sustainable buildings. And we very much hope that you will join us for those events. So thank you once again. Don't forget to complete the feedback form. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.